thank you all a lot. I've not had enough time to speak with all of you individually over the course of this week. Oh, I should use this too, that's right. I've not had enough time to speak with, I've spoken with some of you, but not enough of you, and I apologize for that. At least now you'll have a chance, all of you will have a chance to ask me questions or point out errors that I've made. Over the years, between the first Ithiel de Sola Pool lecture that I gave and this last, I've written a lot of books. Probably, I'm not sure, 6 books, something like that. All of them very long books. And I've also spent a lot of time working in the public sector, including in government, because I was a member of the American National Security Council, the advisors to the president, a long time ago. A recurring theme in this talk will be, I am really old. And if you survive long enough, you get a chance to make lots of mistakes and even maybe occasionally to write lots of books. So I'm going to be talking mostly about my last book, which is in some sense, in a certain sense, a summary of much of what I've done earlier. But altogether, somebody in my staff once counted up, I have written 1 million words over the course of my career, and I'm prepared to stand by every single word. So feel free to ask me questions about religion, or about, obviously about politics, or about immigration and diversity, or about, the fate of American democracy, and I will stand by, or at least I'll admit when I was wrong in each of those books. It is genuinely a pleasure to be with you here, and I want to learn more in the course of our conversation about your work and how our work, my work and yours might intercede. I'm going to be a wanderer. I hope that doesn't bother you, but in this room it fits very well, so I will wander around between the tables, and sometimes I'll have my back to some of you in order to face others, and please excuse my back. I had lunch today with a number of people who are, I assume, here, and I explained to them that there's research showing that whatever your actual IQ is, if you're wearing a jacket, if you're a man and you're wearing a jacket, that adds 10 IQ points to the average person's estimate. And if you wear a tie, that adds another 10 IQ points. So I wanted to make sure I did that. I was a little late because I wanted to make sure I had that out, because otherwise you would think I really was as dumb as I am, but maybe the but the jacket and the tie may offset the slowness of my wit. Last prefatory point is, again, I explained to people at lunch, I'm really good at remembering citations, but I'm really bad at remembering names. My wife Rosemary and I, she's here with me, have 2 children and 7 grandchildren. We're very proud of each of them, and we spend a lot of time with each of them. But I have to ask each of my grandchildren to wear name tags because I'm so bad on remembering names. So if I've not remembered your name, even from the beginning of your question to the end of your question, I apologize. It's not you, it's me. Okay. I want to begin, and last point, the book I'm going to be talking about here is entirely about the United States, and I know that you're coming from many different places. Some people think that the ideas that I'm going to be outlining for you are relevant elsewhere in the world, and I do, but the underlying evidence here is entirely about the United States, and I apologize to you for that. Let's see. Yeah, can we get that all? Perfect. The name of the book that I'm going to be summarizing for you here is The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. And there's a lot of data in this book and a lot of narrative, but that is the data, and I'm going to be talking about that curve, and I'll explain that in just a second. In some sense, the beginning point for this book is pretty simple. America is in a pickle. That's what my mom would have said. It's a colloquial word meaning America's all screwed up. And you'd have to be blind and living anywhere in the world not to realize in what bad shape America is in. But I want to, if we have the next slide, could we have the next? Perfect. This is what I mean more specifically. Most obviously, America is unbelievably political polarized. The gap between the left and the right, or the Republicans and the Democrats in the United States, has only once in our history been even close to the level of polarization. And since you're American studies, many of you are American studies folks, I can tell you simply, the only period in American history, when I'm talking about data now, the only period in American history which comes anywhere close to the degree of polarization in America was the period between 1860 and 1865. Raise your hand if you know what happened in America between 1860 and 1865. So I do not mean that we are on the verge of civil war yet, but what I mean is, statistically speaking, we are really polarized. Now, separately from that, and really could be completely unrelated, probably isn't, but it is completely it could be completely unrelated. The level of inequality in America, economic inequality, the gap between rich folks and poor folks in America is probably higher than it has been ever in our history, actually. America has historically not been so unequal. We've had our ups and downs, as I will show you, but we've never been as unequal as we are now. And it looks like that's continuing, just as it looks like polarization is continuing. Then, and I'm going to spend a little more time in a second here. For the moment, I'm asking you just to take on faith what I've said, but you don't have to take on faith. I'm going to be showing you lots and lots and lots of data in a minute, which will reinforce or confirm what I'm saying to you now. Then, thirdly, and again, apparently completely unrelated, the level of social isolation in America has probably never been as great as it is today. It's a little harder here because the actual number, the data, are a little weak going back. We do know actually a lot about social connections in America, rises and falls, over the last 125 years, but we can't go back to the middle of the 19th century to be sure about that. So and if you've read any of my work, what I'm talking about here is social capital. But you don't need to worry about the jargon. Social capital just means social connections, the networks that link us together. And those are more feeble now. And one consequence of that is we are now in the midst of a widely discussed epidemic of loneliness in America. And in itself, that is causing lots of problems. I mean, serious problems. Suicide rates high because of loneliness. Death rates higher than they otherwise would be because of loneliness. So that's this third dimension, social isolation. And fourthly, harder to measure, but I'm going to try to convince you that I've got some measures here. I know that many of you are really interested in culture, and all of us who are interested in culture know that it means a million different things. But I'm going to be talking about culture largely in terms of the degree to which we think of ourselves, Americans think of ourselves as all in this together. We think we're a kind of and act as though we're all in the boat together. Or, by contrast, the degree to which Americans have thought of themselves at various points in time as being out for number one. And we should be out for number one. Those are two different poles, hard to measure, but I will try to tell you, I usually don't go into so much detail methodologically as I'm going to on that point because you're an Americanist group, and I want to give you an illustration of how I am trying to study culture along that dimension, basically the dimension between I and we, how I've measured that, actually. So, all of those four apparently independent measures show ups and downs in America, and show all of them that we're in a real downer now. And from one point of view, the purpose of this question is purpose of this book is to answer the question, how did we get here? How did we get in this awful situation? And then relatedly, if we could figure that out, does that history tell us anything about how we could get out of it? I am, and increasingly I am in my work, some of you will know my work and know this, but it's grown over time. I don't want to just study the world. I want to change the world. I'm borrowing there, as some of you will recognize, from the inscription on Marx's tombstone in Highgate in London, saying, others come to study the world, he came to change it. And I don't put myself in the same category as Marx, and I'm not in that category ideologically, but that's my view. I think social scientists have an obligation, not just to describe things, whether they're good or bad, but to figure out how to improve them. And that, in fact, is a core belief of mine, so I'm happy to talk with you more about that, because I think that's, in some sense, that's the most controversial point I want to illustrate here, which is that social science is not just about facts. It's not just about the is's, it's also about the oughts. So, how did we get here? Let's have the next slide. And now, this is the numbers part. If you're a numbers person, this is great, and we're going to talk a lot about numbers. But if you're not a numbers person, that's fine too. Some people are, some people aren't. Just close your eyes and settle back. And if he says anything interesting, your neighbor will nudge you. And then I promise you we'll get to the good part. That is the non-quantitative narrative part of this story, because it has two different parts. So this is the data part, and this is that first variable that I measured, polarization. For convenience sake, all these variables are going to be displayed here so that up is good. And so there's no good word for the absence of polarization, but I use political comity here. By the way, this is a work I've done jointly with Shailene Romney Garrett, and that was shown on the cover slide. Shailene is a super intelligent, very, very smart person. She and I have been working together for 25 years, and she's a co-author of this book, and I don't want the fact that I'm speaking here, I'm speaking on behalf of both of us. I'm the numbers guy, and so let's just explain how this graph works. I'll just use this one for now, as opposed to that other screen. The horizontal axis here is time. So that's 1890, and it goes up, 1950, 60, all the way up to now. And most of my graphs, because of when we first did this work, end about the middle teens. This one ends in 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 2015. But we actually have the data now, even beyond 2000. And every graph that I'm going to show you, if I showed you the very most recent data, the number is off this chart. It's way over here and very low. And comedy is low, polarization is high. And the way to read this graph, the vertical axis, of course, is the opposite of polarization. It's political comity. And the way to read this graph is back at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, in the late 19th century, America was very polarized. And so let me just pause for a second. How did I measure that? Many measures, and they all tell the same story. So if you look at the degree to which the political parties agree in Congress, that's one measure here. And back then, and even more now, there's essentially no agreement in Congress. You know this if you're following the news at all, because you know the fraction of Democrats who vote with Republicans or vice versa is essentially zero. We could not be any more polarized than we are, but there have been periods when we've been a lot less polarized. But back in there, we were almost as polarized. American politics was in that sense tribal, but there are other measures you can use besides just the voting in Congress. You can look at politics in local government. I'm not going to give you the footnotes for every single variable here, but there's good data on the degree to which local politics has been polarized, and that graph looks the same as this graph. It even includes things like interpersonal feelings between individual Democrats and individual Republicans. One of the standard questions that sociologists have been asking Americans for a very long time is essentially, in a sexist era, this was originally said, would you let your daughter marry one? That is to say, how would you feel if one of your children married a person of a different kind? And mostly at that point, they were asking people about religion. If you're a Catholic, how would you feel about your child marrying a Protestant or a Jew or vice versa? Sometimes it was about race. How would you feel if one of your children married a person of a different race? Or a different region of the country, that sort of thing. They happened also then to ask, how would you feel if your child married a person of the other party? If you're a Republican, how would you feel if your child married a Democrat? Well, back in the day, up here, by the way, just for reference, I graduated from college there, so I personally experienced the high point here, and that was when I was, when I was dating. That sounds like very old-fashioned language, but that was the language we used now. If you ask Americans how would they feel about one of your children marrying a person of a different religion, for example, that was important to us because Rosemary and I came from different religious backgrounds, so we were worried. And something like 80% of Americans said they would object if one of their children married a person of a different religion. Fortunately, our parents were not typical. They didn't disown us, but most Americans did. Or race. Race was even worse. The number of Americans who said they would, certainly the number of whites who said how they would feel about one of their children marrying a black person, or vice versa, the number was about 95% who objected. By contrast, back in the day, if you ask people, how would you feel if you asked Republican parents, how would you feel if your child married a Democrat, or vice versa, they thought it was a joke. That is, who could imagine anybody caring about the political party of another person? The actual number was, the number of people who objected was about, who had objected, to a child, an in-law, a son-in-law, or whatever, of a different party. It was about 3 or 4%. The vast majority said, who cares? Okay, fast forward to now. Those numbers are almost completely in reverse now. If you ask people now, how would they feel about their person marrying someone of a different religion, almost nobody cares about the religion of their children. Not nobody, but it's maybe 10% of people care about and 90% don't worry about intermarriage along religious lines. It's a little higher than that for race, but it's still surprisingly tolerant. Americans are surprisingly tolerant now. Not all Americans, of course, you know that, but the average American is pretty tolerant about intermarriage, and younger Americans are even more tolerant of intermarriage. But now how about party politics? Now, 80 to 90% of Americans say they would hate it if one of their children married a Republican or a Democrat. And I can't convey to you, since I'm of that generation and you're largely of this generation, I can't convey to you how weird it is to care about the political party of your children's partners. Well, okay, I went on a little long there because I'm trying to convey to you a sense of what these measures are. There are many other measures, the degree to which people, it's called split ticket voting in America, the degree to which people vote for one party for the president and another party for their senator or so on. Split ticket back in the day, split ticket voting was extremely common. People very often voted for Dwight Eisenhower, say. He was the president in the middle of this period. And it's neat to be in a group of Americanists because I don't even have to explain who Dwight Eisenhower was. Or do I? Raise your hand if you do not know who Dwight Eisenhower was. Well, okay, I'll assume you do know who Dwight Eisenhower was. In that period, many people split their ticket. They would vote for Eisenhower, but they'd vote for a Democrat. Or vice versa. They'd vote for, Adlai Stevenson, but vote for a Republican congressman. That's completely gone now. So I've gone on a little long here. What you should get from this is, boy, he's gathered a hell of a lot of data, a heck of a lot of data, and on this variable at least, they all tell the same story. They all tell exactly this story. They tell a story in which, at the end of the 19th century, Americans' politics was very polarized. It gradually began to change. Then it was still pretty polarized here, but it began to go, the direction was this way, and it went up and up. It went up through the 20s and up through the 30s and up through the 40s, up through the 50s, reached its peak actually Eisenhower was president. Eisenhower didn't cause this change. Eisenhower reflected this change. Eisenhower was probably the least, not probably, except for George Washington. Raise your hand if you've heard of George Washington. Okay. Except for George Washington, Eisenhower was the least partisan president in American history. He almost ran on either ticket. So we were very, very depolarized then. But then as you got into the 60s, we began to become slightly more polarized. We're still pretty get along, but then it just keeps going down and down and down and down. And as I said before, now the figure is 2023, we're back at an all-time high of polarization, all-time low of cross-party collaboration. Okay, that's the politics. Now you understand how the graphs work. I'm now going to be a little quicker because the graphs, it turns out all the graphs are going to look the same, so it's going to be easy to kind of follow. Let's have the next slide, please. This is economic inequality, the gap between rich and poor. And once again, I'm going to do just a little bit of dive into the data so you can figure out I'm not making this up. This is measured by many different ways of measuring it. You can measure the gap between rich and poor before taxes and after taxes, and it doesn't matter, it turns out it doesn't matter exactly how you label rich and poor, any way of measuring the gap between rich and poor, or measuring, for example, the odds that someone from a lower class background will make it into the upper, in other words, so upward mobility shows exactly the same measure. And once again, you can see these data actually only begin, the hardest data only begin in 1914, because that's when the IRS was created. I know all of you already knew that the IRS was created in 1914. Then, from there on, we have really hard data on incomes and wealth. And by the way, the same thing is true for wealth. Income is how much you get this year. Wealth is how much you've accumulated over your life. Pattern is exactly the same for that. And this was, if we go back into this period, we have slightly less good data, but it's even lower. We were very, very unequal in that period. But then, you see, the beginning of the 20th century, first decade or so, that began to change. Now there's a pause and reversal of that trend in the 1920s. That's the Roaring '20s. If you know what happened in America during the Roaring '20s, it happened in many European countries too, that was a period in which, in the 20s, there was a boom, so the stock market went up, but it was a hard time for working class, and so that's why the graph goes down. It goes down because of the Roaring '20s, but then even before the crash of 1929, we begin to become more equal. And note, before the New Deal, so this is not just the New Deal I'm talking about here. Even before the New Deal, we'd begun moving rapidly in a more equal direction, and that rises and rises and rises. It's very high there, which is World War II, and you might think, well, of course, that's simple. That's every time a country's at war, there's a greater feeling of solidarity. In American case, there were wage and price controls, which controlled the ability physically controlled the degree to which there was inequality in sacrifice during the war. And that declined a little bit in the aftermath of the war, but then it kept going up. And actually, we were even more equal around 1960 than we had been during the war. So this is not just a story about wartime solidarity. And you may wonder, okay, come on, Putnam, how equal was equal up there? I hope the following fact will surprise you. In 1960, America was the most equal country in the world. The distribution of income in America in 1960 was more equal than Sweden or Denmark. We were the raging socialists or social democrats of the world. We paid high taxes and we had lots of benefits, certainly more than people in Europe. But, and of course that's surprising to you because of what happened after that. There was a little bit of change in Europe, in the Scandinavian countries, but we just plummeted. So up here we were hitting Sweden. Sweden comes down a little bit, but we just plummet. Year after year, more inequality. Reagan's election had a little bit to do with that, but not much. The basic picture is going down before Reagan and it's going down after Reagan. And now, we're not quite yet as bad as they were off in the deep, distant past, but pretty. And what's more important is beginning there, the graph just plummets, and you know why that is. Partly it's COVID, and we know all over the world the effects of COVID were very economic and other and medical. I mean, health effects of COVID were very disproportionately distributed. The costs were distributed very heavily on working class people of all races. That's less true in Europe, so I'm not trying to say that this is exactly the same story every place. And the other reason why, which is American, the other reason why it's now down about here and way lower than it was back there is that a guy named Trump got elected president and cut social benefits for everybody and lowered taxes on rich folks, and that just necessarily mathematically caused this. So that's that graph. If you look carefully, that looks a little bit like the polarization graph, although they're not related. It's not tautological that they had to be that way. They just happen to be that way. Let's go to the next slide, which is maybe a little more familiar to you. This is not a test. I'm just trying to understand the audience. How many have ever heard the term social capital? Raise your hand if you've heard the term. Okay, many of you have. It is a term that I and others use to refer to social solidarity, social connections among people. The core idea is very simple. It's just that social networks have value. They have value to people in the network, and they have value to people outside the network. Different theorists use the term to refer, some of them use the term social capital to talk mostly about the internal effects on people. I tend to focus on that. Other people tend to focus more on the external effects. In any event, it's so every time I use the word social capital, I try to avoid it, but if I use the word social capital, just think networks plus trust. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm talking about here. And again, the data are pretty clear, and I won't bore you with, I know I've risked boring you already with data. I'll just say that graph looks like that if you measure membership in organizations, or you measure, like the Rotary Club. Actually, to my astonishment, I have a picture of myself 3 days ago in the Salzburg Rotary booth at the festival. What was it? I don't know what the local festival was 2 days ago. There was marching and so on, right in the center, right in front of the cathedral. And there were the North Salzburg Rotarians selling food and raising money for good causes. So I know that it's not just in America that people talk about the Rotary. But it was not just the Rotary either. It was all sorts of organizations, people. That's what I mean. It rises, this number rises, depending on membership in organizations. It rises Also, in terms of involvement in local community life, it rises. It's another aspect of it is, as I've said, social trust. Do you trust other people? That graph turns out to look just like this graph. Back in the day here, that's when I graduated from college. And just as soon as I graduated from college, people stopped trusting other people. Post hoc, propter hoc. I'm not sure about that. Certainly there's a correlation. But it's also things like, that I've studied more recently, things like family ties. So let me say what I mean by that. For example, back here, there were, I'm going to use American colloquial language. Back here, there were lots of bachelors and spinsters. Those were the disparaging terms used for men or women who never got married, ever. And at that period in American history, I'm quoting the numbers from memory, but it's roughly 12% of Americans never, ever got married. And they didn't have children either. But then that rose steadily. So up here, that measure, are you married? Have you ever had a partner? I mean, a marriage partner. By the way, the same facts don't depend on whether there's a formal legal wedding license. So I can say partner, I mean, and it doesn't even depend actually on the gender of the two partners. This is what I'm talking about is not a story about the rise of, different gender identities. It's not a story about, it's a story really basically about whether people choose to spend their life with somebody or not. And not just, it's not just, we looked at measures of, are you now married? And we looked at measures, have you ever been married? And they tell the same basic story. And so up at that point, at the top, basically everybody in America got married, and got married quickly. My wife Rosemary and I happened to get married a week after I graduated from college, and that was normal. Most of our friends in college got married the next week too. We have a whole bunch of people who, a couple of months ago, celebrated their 62nd wedding anniversary, and I know that because we all got married the same day. Nowadays, our grandchildren, who are living in this kind of world, think we must have been amazingly oversexed that we had to get married so early in life, because people nowadays basically don't get married until they're in their 30s. Fertility rates, that is, number of children people have, will follow the same basic pattern here. So that's and now just to make the obvious even more obvious, down here, Americans were not connected with other people. They were not connected in organizations, they were not connected in community life, they were not connected in marriage, and they didn't trust one another. But steadily, this is beginning to look familiar, isn't it? Steadily, in the first decade of the 20th century, they began to be a little more connected, and then steadily, there's that same pause in the 1920s. I don't have any idea what explains that, but anyway, after the pause in the 1920s and the 1930s, that line begins to rise again. More and more people, rises steadily. That's World War II. So it wasn't just wartime solidarity. We kept going more and more connected. Ever higher, until Bob and Rosemary got married and graduated from college, and that somehow triggered the collapse of American society. Or at least that's one hypothesis. We should look at other hypotheses here, of course, but that's one hypothesis. And then it just went steadily downhill, down, almost linearly. If you're not quantitative, I can't convey to you how it's astonishing that this is really almost unheard of that you ever have a pattern this clear. And remember, it's not just these three, or I'll in a minute say 4 different variables. It's many measures of those measures. So underneath all of this, is there are about 25 different variables. You know, it's wealth and income and you know, how you choose your life partner and voting in Congress and keep going, all those different things. They all tell the same pattern. I think that this following term may have come from Ithiel de Sola Pool. I'm not sure. It was certainly in that era. Used the term for something that was a big, important statistical finding, powerful statistical finding, passes the interocular trauma test. Interocular trauma test. It hits you between the eyes. Interocular trauma test, that there's something going on there. And it should hit you all between the eyes. How likely is it you get this pattern? Not likely at all. Okay, that's the social cohesion. And as I say, it's just really linearly going down. Okay, let's have the last of these 4 slides, cultural solidarity. Okay, you can see, first of all, just let me describe what the pattern looks like quickly, and then I'll tell you a little bit more how I measured cultural solidarity. This, at the end of the 19th century, just like all these other variables, what this graph is telling you is, however Putnam measured it, that was a period in which Americans were very self-centered, very focused on I. And over the course of the 20th century, again with that strange pause in the early 1920s, we became more and more focused on we, what we had in common, not on I. I haven't proved this to you yet, but I'm trying to say what the story that I want to tell is. And then suddenly, just about the same time that, actually exactly when Rosemary and Bob got married, and people started less and less thinking of their society as a we're all in this together, and more focusing on self-interest. So I want to pause for a second. I haven't given you any data yet, but do you understand the story that I want to tell? Basically, America begins in an I society, we become a we society, and then we go back to being an I society. Okay, so how do you measure this? Well, there are many different measures. One comes, and maybe some of you I know that you're all sophisticated, some of you may even know this data. Google has digitized all books ever published, anywhere. I'm going to focus on the books published in the United States. And you could go to a website and put in any word that you like, a name or a word or whatever, and it will tell you of the books published in a given year, how many use the term in the book, not just the title, in the book, I, or conversely, we. And it'll do the same thing for lots of other variables, but that's the one that I think is most, and they all tell the same story basically. When I did this, by the way, culture was not originally on my list, but some other people told me about this database with the Google database. When I was giving not a job talk, thank God I'm no longer doing job talks, but a presentation, an informal presentation at a seminar in Oxford a couple of years ago, somebody from the back of the room said, there's this new technique, and I bet it would also show you that this same pattern is true for what we might want to call culture. I did not begin with this idea. I began by a suggestion from the audience, so to speak, and maybe some of you, I hope some of you will have other ideas like that. It's a reason why it's a good idea to give talks before you write the book. So in this, if you go to this website, you can type in any word you like. So I'm going to draw the curve, and I'm going to draw the curve for the last 150 years, roughly speaking, going back to more than that, going back to the early 19th century. I mean, you could go all the way back to as long as our books, as long as Google has gobbled them up, you can go back a long way, and you can go back in almost any language. So I urge you to think about this data set. But what does it mean in American terms over this period? Suppose you put it right in there, Lincoln, okay? And if you put that in, and I'm using this graph, well, I can't because it doesn't go back that far. The word Lincoln is used in American books, but not very much. It's almost all travel books about the city of Lincoln, England. So that's the low background. And then all of a sudden, in 1860, that number begins to go up a little bit. A few more books are being written about Lincoln, probably now not more travelers to England, but probably they were, Abraham Lincoln is beginning to appear on the scene. And it goes up, but it does not take off until 1865. Guess why that is? He's assassinated. And now there are hundreds of books every year being. So that graph, if you do Lincoln, and I'm over here is early. That graph looks flat, 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 and then super high, and then it rises and falls with the degree to which Lincoln studies are, important. But you can also use really simple words. You can use the word the, T-H-E, one of the most common words in the English language. And I'm going to show you the graph of the use of the word the over this whole period. Okay so far? Here's that graph. Over at least 200 years, there has been no change in the frequency of the word the. It's pretty frequent, but it doesn't change. There's never a period in which Americans were writing or reading and writing about the. Nope, it was just flat. Or take the word and, A-N-D. It's also one of the, I think it's one of the 5 most common words in the English language. And that graph looks like that. People never stopped using or started using and, just flat. So I got the idea, at the suggestion of these folks listening to my talk in Oxford, well, suppose we used 2 other really simple words. Suppose we use the ratio of the first person plural to the first person singular. And we could call that the we-I ratio. There's no tricks involved here. It's exactly the same thing. And I want you to guess, what does the graph over this period of the we to I ratio, or the ratio of emphasis on community versus emphasis on the individual? It's exactly that graph. I mean, it's the same as all the other graphs. At the beginning of the 20th century, American literature, American letters, both being written and then being read, were very much self-focused. And by the time you get to the middle of the 20th century, people are all the time writing books about the things that we have in common and using we as a pronoun. And then, just as you'd guess, maybe you wouldn't guess, I didn't guess for sure, in the middle 1960s, that changes and people start writing more books with the word I in them. It doesn't matter whether you use I and we or my and ours. There are different cases of the pronouns or us and them. I mean, you can see. It doesn't matter at all. They all show the same basic pattern. And even if you didn't know the data, you knew the fact. And I can pinpoint very exactly why and when this happened. My memory for popular music is weak, so I may get some of the songs wrong. But suppose we did a content analysis of the Beatles songs. And the Beatles are an interesting case because they kind of bridge that point there, right? They come into the stage when we're still on the we side, but by the end, they're still doing singing when we're in the I side. And in the first part, the Beatles were singing, "I want to hold your hand," or "I get by with a little help from my friends," or I can keep going on. Those we songs of affection, disappear from the repertoire. And I can even tell you exactly what month this change occurred. The very last song performed by the Beatles as a group. let's see, this must be in there are Beatles specialists here, maybe it's 1966 or whatever the, what?
The rooftop concert was 69.
69, okay. That's when John goes solo in 1969, I think.
The rooftop concert was the last.
Pardon, the what?
The rooftop concert was the last concert.
Okay. The last song they ever recorded as a single was in I think it's April or something of 1969. I'm just doing this all from memory, so I've forgotten exactly the year, but the dates are, the months are right. I'm going to sing for you the entire lyrics of that song. I'm going to recite for them. I'm not going to try to. And here are the lyrics, the entire lyrics of that song. I, me, mine. 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 ... Forever. That captures this turning point. And the song was, I've now forgotten who wrote it, but it was a complaint by one of the Beatles that all of us are now just focusing on I, me, mine. And John Lennon answered, and this is where I won't get the lyrics quite right, 6 months later by saying, I don't care about the Beatles, I care about me. That's more or less if there's a Beatles specialist in the room, please correct me if I'm completely wrong, but I know I'm not completely wrong. I may not have exactly. It was easy to remember the first lyrics, I, me, mine. It's not so easy to remember exactly what Lennon said, but basically he said, I don't believe in Beatles, I believe in me. Okay, there's another example. I could keep going on because I spent 6 months of my life studying popular music language. Does someplace in here get counted as an American Studies culture specialist? I can't do it now, but believe me, I read and yeah, I did a lot of work on popular music. Here's another one. At one point, early in this period, Alzheimer's strikes. The singer who won the Nobel Prize, Bob Dylan. This happens at a concert in a city in America called Newport. It's called the Newport. It was then called the Newport Folk Festival. And some of you will know this episode because this episode is very famous. So the first part of the concert, he's got his guitar, his actual guitar, and he's strumming there, and he's strumming, the stuff, all the sweet, sappy stuff from the first part, and his fans, who became fans because of that, are all lapping it up. They're loving it, and it's that warm, cuddly. I'd forgotten that he had a partner, a girlfriend at that point, who went along, who was singing along with him, and it was just lovey-dovey stuff. And then curtain, second intermission, second half of the concert. He comes out, no longer with his actual guitar, but with an electronic guitar, and he's strumming this crazy stuff, and his fans all boo because they came in on the we side, and he was now suddenly in the I side. Do you see what I'm trying to say? And okay, well, I know you're the specialist and I'm not, and maybe you don't agree with my analysis of popular culture, but I think there's something to it, and at least it kind of illustrates how quickly this changed on a knife edge. Okay, that ends my attempt to be relevant to a cultural audience. But that's not all I've not finished with all the evidence. Remember, what's the issue I'm trying to show? I'm trying to measure the degree to which Americans either feel that we're all in this together or that we're not. And one measure, I'm quite proud of this measure actually. Think of naming a baby, your baby. Think of naming your baby. You could either like the idea of having your child go along with everybody else in class so that, you want your child to be called Bob because there are a lot of Bobs. I know this because Bob is my name, Don't call me Robert. Nobody does. And Bob, when I was born in 1941, Bob was the 5th most common name in America, at least. How do I know this? Because the Social Security system keeps track of the names of all of the babies born every year going back into the 1860s. So I can show you the data, right? A government document that says Bob was big in 1940, along with Tom, and on the girls' side, Mary was really, really common. You probably can guess all these. They're none of your names because there's a different kind of attitude you could take toward names, and that could be you want your child to stick out. And if that's the case, then you might like to name your kids the way my grandchildren are named, Gideon. Gideon is extremely uncommon. Even today it's extremely uncommon. And that's the point. My children, in naming their children, wanted their kids to stick out. So we've got an Eleanor, and we've got, let me see. I ought to be able to do this, right? Yeah, name tags. We've got Gray, G-R-A-Y, not to be confused with Gray, G-R-E-Y. We've got Noah. I'm giving you names that were given to these kids, in the last 20 years, roughly speaking 20 years ago, and would have been given to kids about 120 years ago. But, and then I should say we got a Miriam, that's pretty unusual, and then we've got an Alonzo. Now what's going on is, Alonzo is rare, but what's going on is half of my grandchildren are Latino, and so Alonzo he's getting from, and that's relevant because you have to, in doing all this work, you've got to be controlled for the fact that if there's a lot of immigrants in the country at a particular point, they're likely to name their children for those languages, and therefore you have to control for that, and we have. So we've got this Alonzo now. Alonzo? Somebody's out there. There's another. Anyway, what I'm. Gee, that's embarrassing. In any rate, what I'm trying to say is, you can calculate a ratio. It's actually called the standard deviation. The degree to which everybody in a given year, all the parents in a given year, wanted their kids not to stick out, or to stick out. That is, are they worried? Are they conformists? They want their kids to be just like that, or do they want their kids to stand out and be individualistic? That chart looks like that. And I didn't make that up. I certainly did not make the data up. Along with another person, I had the idea of using these name things. What I'm trying to convey to you, and I've not even gone all through the other stuff that we've done, to try to get hard measures of individualism or communitarianism. Now, I may or may not have persuaded you, but that's what the graph looks like. And now let's put all 4 of those graphs together. I'm conscious of the time ticking away. Really ticking away. So I'll go quickly, and then I'll leave a lot of time for questions. Let's put all the graphs together. Next slide. And what I've done here is just put all of them together. There's no trick here. You just add them all up and put them together, and they look like that. Well, it's not surprising. All of them look like that. And we call this, Shayla and Romney Garrett and I call this America's I century, beginning in roughly 1890 and ending, actually, then we said about 2020, but actually it's even worse. And that's true separately for economics, politics, society, and if you trust my cultural measures, culture. Now let's have the next slide. Back up just 1 second. I want to just say one more. Sorry, back up. Okay, that's an interesting description. Now I'm going to turn to the narrative, and I'm going to try to draw lessons from those data. I warned you before, I'm going to switch from just one damn factor after another to a lot of oughts. And in order to do that, I need to label some of these things. This period in American history, this is at the very end of the 19th century. Basically, this is the tail end of the Industrial Revolution in America. The second industrial revolution, but the big industrial revolution. And that's a period in which everybody was moving. They were moving from farms and small cities to the city. And in the big city, the old ways of connecting in rural America, barn raisings. Do you raise your hand if you know what I mean by a barn raising? Probably not. It's where the people in the town just get together. This happens in other countries too. The people in the town just get together and build a house for one another. That's called barn raisings. Or quilting bees. Do you know what quilting? Help me. Quilting is a way in which you can make a fabric. God, don't realize yeah. But what is that? I don't know what, quilting. It means making a big fabric. And in rural areas, women in rural areas would get together. They'd have what's called a quilting bee, and they'd all quilt together. So back in that, but those ways of connecting that had fit the 19th century in America didn't work on the Lower East Side of New York or in rural Chicago. That is where the people were now living. And so the larger picture is, back in that period, America was very, very unequal, very isolated socially, and very polarized politically. And this period here in American history from 1900 to 1920 is called the Progressive Era, with a capital P. Raise your hand if you know what if you've heard of the Progressive Era. Okay, it's a period in American history. There were similar periods in Europe too, actually, but periods of intense social reform. And in America, those reformers, they were outraged by this America, and they wanted to change things, and so therefore they formed a movement called the Progressive Movement. And the Progressive Movement did a lot of things that really mattered. I'll come to that more back in a second. And gradually they turned America onto a new path. It didn't happen overnight. Big social changes like this inevitably take decades to happen. So it didn't happen overnight, but they moved, those progressives moved the graph up until, and I want to give a special credit to the progressives. By the way, the word progressive then did not have the partisan. Now progressive means far left or pretty far left, but this was not a partisan movement. There were Republican progressives and Democratic progressives. It was a very heterogeneous movement, but it had the label, the progressive movement, because they wanted to make progress in America. That's where the label comes from. And so let's give them a lot of credit. They were able to change America dramatically in ways that lasted. The trend lasted for 60 or 70 years. If any of us here in this room are able to come up with ways of changing America or our own countries in durable ways that last for 60 or 70 years, give them a gold star. It didn't last forever, and that's the downside of this, of course. Okay, if we have the next slide, I want to try. I will just want to say, just one second. The reason that we want to focus on this period, most people who look at this graph want to look at that set and say, oh, it was wonderful back then. Back to the future, please. But that wasn't, I don't want to, Shailene Romney Garrett and I do not want to go back there. It was not a perfect place. In a lot of ways, it was not a perfect place. We were not nearly, in racial terms especially, we were not nearly so equal as we needed to be. I'm prepared later on to talk more about race if you'd like, but I'm trying not to cut stuff from the talk. So it was not a wonderful place. We had a presidential candidate a few years ago who wanted to go back to the future. What was his slogan? This was a guy named Trump. Make America great again. And make America great again meant going back. That's not my view in the slightest. But we could learn lessons from that period. And that's where, this is the last slide actually. Next slide. What lessons can we learn from the last upswing? So, make sense so far? Now, there's a big switch now, because now I'm firmly in lessons to be learned. First of all, because this data is so quantitatively rich, the normal thing to do is to say, well, what's the leading indicator? Raise your hand if you know what I mean by a leading indicator. A leading indicator is a variable that moves before everything else. It's leading the charge. And therefore, if you can figure out what was the leading indicator, That might give you a clue as to, what's going on and how you could fix it. And we, like all good social scientists, thought that economics is the root, not the root of all evil, the root of all social change, and so we thought, it's got to be economics. Economics, we thought, would... But that turns out to be completely wrong. Economics is a lagging indicator. Now, I'm not trying to say economics is not important. I'm just trying to say if you want to fix America today, the best historical evidence is you do not begin with economics. That's going to come later. And now, actually, I am getting into stuff that I hope you will take seriously. I hope to take it all seriously. But I hope you take it seriously because I'm now speaking from the heart. Economic reform is really important, but that's not what's going to get us started on the new upswing. Are we all on the same page here? So if it wasn't economics, what was it? Well, we put together some of the quantitative data and some of the qualitative data, and to my shock, the leading variable turns out to be culture. Now let me say, what does that mean? It means that before they could get anything else done, they had to change the culture, the morality of America. You may not agree with me. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm trying to make a really big, important point now. It's not the normal stuff of politics that we need to change. We need to change morality in America. In their case, I will say this very quickly because you're all Americanists, so you'll know what I'm talking about. In the 1870s and 80s, the dominant public philosophy in America was something called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was the idea that if it works for animals, it might work for us, and therefore the devil take the hindmost, and we'd all be better off if we all just focused on our own self-interest. And we should certainly not give aid. We should certainly not have rich people pay taxes to support poor people, because that's just supporting the losers in the biological competition. That's what, it now seems silly, but that's what, so Darwin didn't believe this, by the way, but that's what the social Darwinists said. That was succeeded about 10 years later by something called the social gospel. The social gospel was an idea, which actually could have some relevance today. These were Christians, actually evangelical Christians in America, who basically said, read the damn Bible. Read the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount does not say rich people are going to be great. It says it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than to get a camel through the eye of a needle. Every word of the Sermon on the Mount is about community and about being equal and about helping the least of us. And so these social gospel people, but the idea quickly spread beyond evangelicals, beyond Protestants. There was a similar movement in the Catholic Church at that same point, and then it gradually spread across the whole of America. So, coming quickly to this last point, Shana and I believe that if we're going to fix America today, you've got to begin with people's hearts. And if you can change people's sense of their obligations to other people, I mean, I'd like to convince you, I probably don't need to, but I'd like to convince you, if you want to change America or your own country, don't begin with the policies, begin with the oughts, begin with the moral obligation to other people. That's the way it worked last time, and I think that's the way it's going to work this time. A couple of other quick lessons from that, and then I will shut up. The progressive people were all very young, very young. They were all in their 20s. Old people are not good revolutionaries. Old people are good at saying something's gone wrong. I'm good at saying things are going wrong because I've lived in a different... My grandchildren have never lived in a society in which people weren't selfish. But I have the ability, just because of when I happen to be born, to say it didn't used to be that way. But I'm way too old to begin working out policies for or messages for that will last into the 2050s. I'll be long dead. It's my grandchildren who are going to be bright enough to come up with some new ideas that will be relevant for that long time. So it was not an accident that all these progressive people were very young. They were and I wish I could say more about this because it's all, I think, pretty interesting. It was this was a movement that was led from the bottom up, not top down. It was not some great man who says, this is how we're going to fix America. All of the ideas came from grassroots in America, small town communities, actually, is where the innovative ideas came from. And charismatic leadership was not part of the story. This was, Teddy Roosevelt actually was a leader, a very articulate leader, when he was president when he ran for president, especially in 1910. He was like the leader of the French Revolution who saw a parade and ran and got in front of it. The hard work had been done 20 years earlier at the bottom, not at the top. And last thing that I wish I should say a lot more about, but now I really am out of time and we can talk about this later. I've been praising the progressive era for emphasis on we, but the we was not exclusive enough. The we that the progressives were posing was largely a white we. And although the issue here is a little more complicated, largely a male we. But that's more complicated because after all, this is the same period in which the suffrage movement came to its fruition. And I could tell you a lot more if you want to about the gender patterns here. But certainly, the main point I want to make is that the flaw in this otherwise attractive picture is that the progressive movement was not inclusive enough. One last point. We, reading this story, Shaylin and I, think we're talking about not a deterministic wave of history. And you know there are these things, that every 20 years or every 40 years or whatever, there's a new wave of history. We don't think that at all. We think that that people can determine their own future. There were people in that progressive movement, everybody around them was saying America's going to hell in a handbasket, and most Americans believed them. But this small group of people didn't believe that. They took the reins of history, I'm changing metaphors here, into their own hands and decided they were going to change the world, and they did. And that's the lesson. This book is mainly written for Americans in their 20s. We're trying to, not to tell an empirical story, we're trying to change America, and the way to change America is to get young people today actively involved, and we want them to understand that their fate is not determined by history. You see, this is the larger point I'm trying to make. We can make change ourselves. Those people did. They didn't cause the problem. My generation, if anything, caused the problem. But they're the ones who history has given the task, if they choose to take it up, of changing America. There are signs blowing in the wind that young people are doing this. Sorry, Alzheimer's strikes. The Swedish girl who's Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg exemplifies what it will look like if we're changing America. A young person, worried about the problems of the future, and using moral language. Read what she says. She's not talking about, particles per whatever. And hers is not a technical message. It's a moral message. You guys screwed up, and you're screwing us. And that's what it will take.
She said, "How dare you?"
Pardon?
She said, "How dare you?"
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Well, now that's one. But we have a similar movement, anti-gun movement among young people, and it's not determined. I repeat, it's not determined. But I've got faith in them. Thank you for being such an attentive audience. I'm sorry.